In this session, we will learn how to remove the spent transactions from the UTXO and also add the new transactions in the UTXO. So now that we have the memory pool functionality up and running, so that means we are creating new transactions. So those transactions should go inside the unspent transactions, and at the same time we need to remove the transactions that we are using. So let's go ahead and implement the functionality. First, remove this Coinbase, because until this step we were just adding the Coinbase transaction. So remove this and update this function. Okay, so remove this step as well. Run a for loop for tx in self.add transaction. So in add transaction we have all the new transactions, which means those are unspent transactions. And move this inside the for loop and update tx id and the transaction itself, tx, save it. And the next step is we need to implement the function to remove the transactions that are already been used. So define remove spent transactions self pass. So first let's prepare this list from where we will read the data, what all transactions we need to remove. So we are already reading the data from the memory pool, so we just need to add one more list here. So add self dot remove spent transactions, set it to empty, and here create a for loop here for spent in self dot mempool. So we are reading the transaction from memory pool, and then we are just concerned about transaction inputs. So read the transaction input. Now here we will add the previous transaction hash and the previous transaction index in the remove spent transaction list that we just created. So do self dot remove transactions dot append and create a list, and inside the list we will do spent dot previous transaction hash comma spent dot previous transaction index, and based on these two fields we will remove the transactions that are already been spent. Go back to remove spent transaction function and implement the logic to remove the transactions. Open a for loop for tx id and index in self dot remove underscore spent transactions. So we have stored the previous transaction hash and the transaction index, so we are reading it here, and do if tx id underscore index 0th index, which is our previous transaction hash, convert it into hex and check if it is there in self.utxos. If length self.utxos and tx id index 0. So basically this is the transaction hash, and we are checking if the transaction outputs are less than 2, then we can straight away delete the transaction. And do del self.utxos tx id index 0 dot hex. For example, if we are using the Coinbase transaction and we know that in Coinbase transaction we are transferring the amount to just one person, but if it is a regular transaction, so then transaction output could be 2. First, to the person whom you are sending the coins, and second, your change transaction. So if it is a Coinbase transaction, then we can simply delete it if we have spent. And the second is if it is a normal transaction, do previous transaction equals to self.utxos txid index previous transaction hash, convert it into hexadecimal, and self.utxos tx index 0 x equals to previous transaction output outs dot pop the index that we have already spent, txid index 1. First, let's fix this. This was supposed to be transaction ID and index. So do Control D, select everything that you want to change and do txid underscore index, and it will change it in all the places. Save it. So first let's understand what exactly we did here. If in case there is only one transaction output that we have already spent, so we can straight away clean or delete the entire transaction. But if in case there are more than two transaction outputs, miner will only delete the transaction output that has been spent, and he will keep the other one for the future reference, because it's possible that the other person may use that transaction in future. Okay, now let's quickly test if everything is working fine. So first thing, add a print statement here. Transaction added, add the transaction ID. We are adding the print statement so that we can visualize what transaction was added and which one was deleted. Copy this, paste it here as well, and do spent transaction removed, and update the transaction ID to this. Save it. Okay, let's fix the alignment. Save, and also call this function right here, self dot, and remove all the breakpoints. Set the breakpoint right here, run and debug. Click on continue. Mining has started. Okay, so block is mined and we can see this transaction ID has been added. So this is our Coinbase transaction. Now let's transfer coins to someone else by using this Coinbase transaction from this account to this account, and let's transfer 10 Bitcoins. Okay, so now transaction is there in a memory pool. Continue, and I'll click on continue. Okay, mining is going on. All right, so we can see it here. It did use this transaction, and after using the transaction, it has removed it. Spent transaction removed. Right? It was the Coinbase transaction, so there was no other transaction output. There was only one transaction output which we have already used. So we have removed the entire transaction. This is the second transaction, which is the Coinbase transaction for this block, and this is the transaction where we transferred the 10 Bitcoins to the other address, right? And in the same transaction, we have the change as well, where we have transferred the money back to our address. I hope it is clear now.